In this video, Jordan Peterson explains the useful ways of using words.
One of the things I mentioned to you about, I talked to you a little bit about words at one point and what words signify, and this is a very complicated problem, and so most of you are probably Augustinians without really knowing it, because St. Augustine originally proposed that a word was a label for a thing. And of course that's how people naturally think. I mean, I'm sure most of you would regard that definition as perfectly suitable. But it's not, it's by no means the only definition. And it's by no means necessarily the correct definition. So there's a famous philosopher named Wittgenstein who proposed instead that a word was like a piece in a chess game, which meant that it was something that it was something that you did something with, or you might think about it actually as a tool. And when you think about how you use words, then you can see that you're using them often as tools to interact with other people, so that for a purpose, right? The words have a purpose, and so the word is a tool. And what I like about the tool idea is a very, very evolutionarily sophisticated concept, partly because we're tool-using creatures, probably beyond our other capacities, except for possibly imitation and language, which set us so far apart from other animals. But the thing about a tool is that the difference between a tool and an object is an object doesn't have a user. The word object doesn't imply user, but the word tool implies user. And it's not obvious that we ever interact with anything in the world without interacting with it in some motivated way. And so what we're doing is using words to get through the world, to interact properly within the world, and to move to where we want to go. And so, okay, so that's the second way of thinking about a word. Here's another way of thinking about a word. A word is like a box of things. And so imagine that you've cleaned out your basement and there's a bunch of boxes downstairs, and one box is labeled books. Well, inside that box there can be any manner of books. Books is a very, very diverse set of phenomena. If you're moving, books are kind of condensed into one thing, which is heavy objects that are made out of paper. And you can also imagine another box that says things. And in the thing box, I'm sure you have a thing drawer at home where you put all the things that you don't know what to do with. And so it's like the category of all things that you don't know what to do with. Things. Okay, so a word can also represent a relatively heterogeneous set of tools or entities. And that's very, very, very useful to know. Because one of the things that happens often when people are arguing is that they use the same word, but each word contains a set of different objects. So you might say, for example, is fear real? And questions like that are very strange. They're not really answerable in some sense, because it depends on exactly what you mean by fear, because fear can contain a lot of heterogeneous entities, roughly speaking. And then it also depends on what you mean by real. And so you can define fear and you can define real so that fear is a subcategory of real, or you can define fear and you can define real so that fear isn't a subset of real. So like the idea that fear is a box that only contains a certain set of entities or a certain set of tools, and that reality is the same, is wrong. And people argue about those sorts of things all the time. And they make these binary questions like, is X a Y? Well, X and Y are generally not well enough defined so that you can easily come up with an answer to a binary question like that. Okay, so words can also represent a relatively heterogeneous set of attributes or objects or tools. When you say that someone's a good person, for example, you don't mean that they're a good person all the time, or that everything they've ever done in their entire life is good, because they wouldn't be a good person and they'd be a saint or some other fictional character like that. So when you're applying the label, we'll call it a label for the purposes of this argument, it's a descriptive tool actually. When you're applying a term like that to someone, it's a shorthand for a variety of states that this person could exist in, the majority of which you would regard as positive. And you might say, well, he's a better person than she is. And then you'd say, well, the proportion of attributes that she has, I think I said she, whatever, it exceeds the proportion of positive attributes that this other person has. So the other way that you can think about a word is, this is more complicated, it involves a little bit of visualization. So imagine that you have a child's train on a track, it's going around and around the track, and it's got cars on it that you can put things in, and all the cars are full of things. And then on the track there's a box with cutouts in it so that the train can pass through, and on top of the box is a word, and the word is things, and the train is going through the box. And in some sense what that would mean, imagine the train was long enough, is that at any given second the box of things would contain different things, but it would still be a box of things. And a lot of words we use are like that. Not only do they represent a heterogeneous set of entities, but the set changes depending on the context that we use the word in. So, alright, so the reason I'm telling you that is because a word, here's another way of thinking about a word. This will be good for you well, you're all computer people now, of course. A word is a low resolution image. So you think about it. A word is a good enough approximation of the thing that it's representing, sort of like a thumbnail. Now obviously, one of the differences between a thumbnail and the real thing is that the real thing exists at a much higher level of resolution. It exists at many, many more layers. But you can use the thumbnail to represent it. And the advantage to doing that is that it doesn't take up much processing time, and it doesn't take up much memory. So lots of times you want to use the shorthand for the thing rather than the thing because it's just too complicated otherwise. And often, then you might say, well, how do you know that your shorthand representation is a good representation of the thing that you're trying to represent? And the pragmatist would say, well, it depends on what you want to do with it. That's the tool-like aspect, say. It's like, if you're using word X to represent potentially heterogeneous class Y, and when you use it, you get to where you want, or you get close enough to where you want, then it's good enough. So it's how you know a joke is good enough. Well, someone laughs. It's like, okay, the joke is good enough. And so one of the things that's quite interesting about the way that you interact with the world, and this is something the pragmatists really discovered in some sense, was that you're always aiming at some bounded set of events that's somewhat different from the current set of events, because otherwise you could just sit there. And then you put your conceptions to work and your actions to work to manage the transformation. And if you manage the transformation, then it's good enough. And you don't have to go any farther than that. So that explains partly how you can maneuver in the world with limited knowledge. You use low resolution representations to partially hit vague goals. And that generally gets you there. That process was called satisficing by... Now, what's his name? He's an extraordinarily famous economist and psychologist. Anybody remember who coined the word satisficing?
Well, economist, psychologist would be Herb Simon.
That's right, it's Simon. Thank you, that's exactly right. It was Herb Simon. So, and he said, well, you're often not out to optimize, let's say, in a search for a partner. Well, to optimize it, you'd have to search through several billion people. Well, you're not going to do that because you don't have the time. And so then you might say, well, you don't know exactly how you do it, but it's something like this. You have 5 attributes that you're looking for, and maybe 2 that you don't know you're looking for, but you are looking for. And the first person that comes along that matches those well enough, you pick. And so it's not an optimization issue. But, given that you have a limited amount of time, you can't wait around for optimized solutions. You have to go ahead with sufficient, and then move to the next issue. Okay.